Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with a guide and some comments on the study of Lesson 4 in the Academy's Classical Grammar course. And in case you're watching on YouTube or you're not enrolled in the course, our Classical Grammar course teaches English grammar, but it does so in a way that's designed for students who are going to be studying the classical liberal arts. So it's a special textbook that was written to teach the English grammar for students who will be participating in classical Latin and Greek studies. So it's a very helpful course to get started in classical studies. In Lesson 4, we study the topic of number in nouns, number. And I'd like to go through the main points of this lesson because modern textbooks and modern study programs often present rules to students to tell them how to make plural forms of nouns. And they give them this list of rules, and the children are taught that if they learn these rules, they'll know how to make plural forms of words. And when the kids actually try to do that in real life, they find that those rules don't work. There are too many exceptions. They work sometimes and not other times. Both options may be acceptable. Different writers may use different methods of writing plurals, and it leads to a lot of confusion. And the reason why there is this confusion is because when we try to oversimplify rules, we often actually teach students the opposite of the point of the rules in the lesson if we would actually study it carefully. So let's work through this lesson on number in nouns together, because I'd like to make sure that students don't get distracted by the rules and miss the whole point of the lesson. So as I said, Lesson 4, the topic is of number in nouns. And as we know in English, there are only two different numbers in grammar, and that's singular, which represents one object, and plural, which represents any number greater than one, two or more. Singular and plural. These are the only numbers in English grammar. And in speech, we need to find ways, especially in writing, we need to find ways to show whether we're speaking of one person or one thing, or whether we're speaking of a multitude of two or more things. And the way that we do that in language, both in speech and in writing, is by using different forms for singular nouns and for plural nouns. The normal way to do this in English is to add the letter S at the end of a word. So for example, if I have a book, the noun book refers to one book. This is the number of this noun is singular. It's a singular noun. If I want to speak, however, of a number of books, the way that we do that in English is we add the consonant S, and the S creates a form that represents the plural number. Pretty simple. Everyone understands this. But some strange things happen. For example, if I have a word like church, and I say, on Sunday I'm going to church. It's pretty simple. But then if I say, while we were driving across the country, we saw many churches. And we see that this creates an awkward pronunciation. Churches. We don't want to do that in English, so we make an adjustment to this form. We don't put an S at the end of this word. We create a separate syllable by adding a vowel and then end with the S. So we create a syllable and add it to the word for one simple reason. And this is what I mean when I say students need to make sure they understand the reasons for these changes. We do this for one simple reason, because it's easier to pronounce and it sounds better. That's it. The reason we don't write church with an S at the end is because that would be difficult to pronounce and it doesn't sound very nice. It makes no difference to write. If we were just to put an S at the end of church, that would be fine in writing. But when we're speaking, it's not comfortable, it's not easy to put an S at the end of church and say churchs. We have to really emphasize that S when we don't necessarily want to emphasize the S. And so we simply add a syllable that's not accented, and that makes it very easy to speak. Now, we're beginning to learn that there are rules for making plural nouns, and your textbook here, I have the book in front of me on the screen, the textbook goes through all the different rules, and they're helpful. They're helpful guides to show you different ways in which plural nouns are formed in English. But there's only one rule, and that rule has to do with what's called euphony. Euphony. In Greek, eu means good, and this P-H-O-N, phone, we know like telephone, right? Microphone, same origin. It means sound, okay? So euphony means good sound. Sounds good. These rules allow us to practice euphony, good euphony. It makes our language sound clearer and more pleasant. It makes it easier for us to speak, so we're not stuttering and slurring words and making all kinds of pronunciation mistakes because of the words, because they're difficult to pronounce. What happens over time is forms and words change to become easier to pronounce, and that's called euphony. That's the reason for the rule. If you understand the concept of euphony and just pay attention to your own pronunciation, you'll often be able to figure out the proper way to do something because it simply sounds better. And let me give you an example. If you look in maybe an old copy of the Latin Bible, where we learn the Lord's Prayer in the Gospel of Matthew, we read, "Ne nos inducas in tentationem." The original Latin word, which we keep in English, was temptationem. Temptationem. And in English, we say temptation. Temptation. But you can see that pronouncing that word, and I encourage you just to say that word a few times and make sure you pronounce it clearly. Make sure you pronounce the M and the P and the T. Temptation. Temptation. It's difficult to say. It takes some concentration. Well, if we look at a Latin Bible or medieval copy, a later copy of Latin prayers, we look at the Lord's Prayer, we'll see that the spelling of this word is changed. And we'll see that the M and the P have been replaced by an N. It's the same word, but the medieval Latinists changed the spelling. And why did they change the spelling? Well, go ahead and say this word, tentationem. Tentationem. Now go and say this word, temptationem. Temptationem. Tentationem. You can see how much easier it is to articulate the word when the M and the P have been replaced by the N. This is an example, not of some random changing of words over time, but of the principle of euphony being practiced to make a word easier to pronounce. And if you're saying your prayers, you'll find that saying, "Ne nos inducas in tentationem," is much easier to say than ne nos inducas in temptationem. And that's why the change is made. This is an example of freedom that we have in written language and spoken language to take into consideration how easily a syllable or a word is pronounced and how nice it sounds, how pleasant it is to speak and hear. And that's what we mean by euphony. The reason for many of these rules about making plural forms of nouns is based entirely on euphony. And you can also often just think about how the word sounds and how it's pronounced and figure out how the plural form should be made. So let's look at a couple examples. I gave you one example of church. And we saw how trying to add an S at the end was difficult to pronounce, and so instead of just adding an S, we add a syllable with a vowel. Churches. That's much easier, much clearer, much more pleasant to speak and to hear. I'm just going to scroll through and look at some examples from the lesson. We see another one of these rules tells us that when a word ends in an F, when a noun ends in F, we don't simply add the S. And again, if I ask, why is that? Why is it not good to just add an S? Because it's hard to pronounce. Wolves. Wolves. It's hard to pronounce. Go ahead and try it. Try to say wolves. It's difficult. So we make a change for the sake of euphony. And instead of that F, we use a V. Wolves. 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 And you'll see that's much easier to pronounce. The euphony of wolves is better than that of wolves. And so there's a special rule that makes this change. Another example of this rule is found with the word knife. You could say knives, 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 but you'll see it's difficult to pronounce. And if we simply change this F and replace it with a V, knives, knives, much easier to pronounce. And that's why the rule is what it is. Simple, okay? Simple principle of euphony, or ease and pleasantness of pronunciation, that makes these different rules. Let me see if I can find some more. I'll look at a different rule here and talk about a different situation. We learn that words that end in Y often form their plural by replacing the Y with IES. So we'll take a word like pony. We don't write ponies with an S at the end. We don't write that. We write instead IES. Ponies. Ponies. In our lesson, there are some other examples, other exceptions, and sometimes there are no explanations. And the reason why is because we have to remember that the English language is taking words from different languages. It's taking words from Latin, from Greek, from German, from French, from Old English, from Middle English, and bringing all of these words into our modern English language. And sometimes it brings spellings with them into our language. So as you go through all of these examples in your lesson, just read through and see what the rules are, what the exceptions are, and try to think to yourself as you go through them and ask, why is this rule what it is? Why is this exception what it is? And realize that there are usually two reasons. One is euphony, and the other is because these words are coming in from different languages. Let's go on and look at another concept in our lesson. There are some nouns that have no plural form. There are some nouns that have no plural form. And we could say there's two different kinds of nouns that have no plural form. One are nouns that are often used in a collective sense. You remember in our lesson on nouns in classical grammar, we learned about collective nouns. So for example, if you take the noun deer, the animal, deer, we rarely see or speak of deer as individuals in number. We rarely think of deer because they're wild animals. They're usually at a distance, and we usually see them in a group, in a multitude. We rarely ever speak of deer as individuals. They often look the same. We can't distinguish between them. We see them and we say, oh, look, deer. And we just refer to the group of deer. We don't speak about individual deers. And so this word, if we see one animal, we'll say, oh, look, a deer. And if we see a multitude, we'll say, oh, look, deer. The same word, same form, whether singular or plural. But notice what I did. One clue that we do have is I used the article a when I talked about the singular. I said, oh, look, a deer. There's a deer in the backyard. We distinguish and we make it clear that we're talking about one by using an article. When we talk about the group, we don't use an article. We say, oh, look, there are deer in the backyard. Okay, so the form may be the same, but there's other ways that we distinguish the plural. We use the what's called the indefinite article to identify one deer, a deer, or the deer, that deer. Okay, and when we speak about the group, we may not use an article. So that's an example. The same can be true of fish. Some people say it's okay to refer to fish in the plural, but it's the same idea as deer. When you see fish in a natural setting, not in a fish tank, but in a natural setting, the fish are almost always in a group, in a school of fish. And when we see them, we see a multitude and we refer to them as fish. Oh, look, fish. And in the same way, we may say, oh, look, a fish. We may distinguish a singular with the article, but we'll refer to the group as fish. But it is possible sometimes, as our textbook explains, to use fishes, but usually when we're seeking to emphasize that there is a collection of individuals for some reason. Okay, so usually there's a reason why someone would make that distinction. The normal way to refer to a multitude of fish is with the same form we'd use to speak of one, fish. All right, so that's one example of, or two examples of nouns that have no plural form. There are others, though, what are called abstract nouns, or nouns that don't name objects, that don't name physical objects or objects outside of the mind, but that name ideas. such as happiness. We're usually not going to use abstract nouns in the plural because the abstract idea is itself singular. But there are examples where we do use this, usually in certain expressions that are somewhat poetic or intended to emphasize some idea by using a plural form. But normally, abstract nouns like happiness, courage, nouns that name ideas, ideas that exist in our minds, are normally kept in a singular form because it doesn't make much sense to have a plural form unless you're intentionally trying to make a point and you're creating this awkwardness on purpose to stretch, to express something. For example, I could say, this man over here talks about what he would do if he were a soldier, and this man over here actually has been in war and is an experienced soldier. They both imagine themselves to have courage, but their courages are different. Okay, so you see, that's like an intentional play on the plural form to make a point. Okay, so that's what your author is explaining in lesson 4. There are nouns, however, that do not have plural forms. Another point that the textbook shows us is that there are some words where almost the entire word changes to make a plural form. So we have a word like child. And we don't say childs. We don't say childs. We use a very different form and say children. Children. That's the plural form of child. We can do the same thing for brother. We can say brothers. We can say brothers in one context, but in another context, we use a different word. And we may say brethren. Brethren is a plural form of brother. Two different options for plurals for brother. So sometimes the entire word changes. We can take a word like goose, and we don't say gooses. We change the word and use a different word to refer to plural, geese. Another example. Another common example, mouse, we say mice. But a word that looks very similar to mouse, house, we say houses. And so you can see that there's just a variety in these ways of forming plurals, and you need to be comfortable with that variety. The English language is a very complex language because, as I said, it comes from a number of different languages, and that leaves us with all kinds of irregularities and different forms, different styles, different customs, and so on. And we pick these things up over time by experience. But it's good for you to read through the rules, because what the rules try to do is make some order, or at least give us a good place to start if we need to take a guess. If we see a word, for example, if I see the word life, and let's say I've never seen a plural form of that word before, and I'm going to take a guess about how to form the plural of life, I can think of other examples that I do know, or I can think of a rule that I know. I can remember, for example, that the word knife was written as knives with a V. And if I had to take a guess, I would choose to guess according to the rule. So even if the rules are not perfect, they help to direct us to the general ideas or the general ways that things are done. And again, they show us the importance of euphony in considering the effect that different ways of making plural forms affects the sound and pronunciation of words. So as you study this lesson, do study carefully and learn all the details of the lesson, because the lesson quiz will cover all of the details. But as you do so, make sure you pay attention to ideas like euphony and ask yourself, why are these rules what they are? And see if you can come up with good answers for why the rules may be what they are. I'm going to ask you a few questions like that in the written assignment and see what you can come up with. But I've given you an example of how when we speak of deer, we speak of them in the plural because we usually don't single out a number of individual animals, but we speak of the herd of the deer. The same with fish in the ocean. We see a school of fish, we speak of them together as a group and call them fish collectively. So there are reasons for the things that we do. Sometimes there may appear to be no reason, but if you dig and poke around and study the history of the language and get into the history of a word, which is another kind of what's called etymology, you can learn that there is some historical origin and explanation for why a certain word is written as it is. And that's one of the interesting studies in language, is just going back into history and learning the origins of different forms and expressions. It's called etymology, and that's one of the most interesting studies in language. In most good dictionaries, you'll see the word and the definition given, but you'll also see a section that discusses the etymology of the word, or the history and the origin or the source of the word. It's good to read those entries and learn a little bit about the history of words, because usually the real meaning of the word can only be understood when we look back at its source, where it came from, what it meant in another language, how that word was used in a different language. That helps us to really understand its meaning in our language. The only other note that the lesson makes that I think is worth noting is that there are some nouns that only have plural forms, because we simply would never speak of them in a singular form. And they give you some examples like ashes. We would never speak of an ash individually. We only speak of ashes. And so that's going to be a word that has a plural form but doesn't appear to have a singular form. Other than that, I think the lesson is pretty clear. There is a last section that deals with proper names, because proper names, again, normally when we use a proper noun, the whole point of a proper noun is that we're speaking of a certain individual. But there are certain times when we do need or wish to speak with a proper name, and yet we find that we need a plural form for it. For example, if you have two friends and both of them are named James, how do you refer to both of them? If their name is James, do you refer to them as the two James, because it already ends in S? I have two friends, two James. Or do we change this to Jameses? Okay, that's a question that's taken up in your lesson, and we see that there are different situations. Or if I have a friend named Mary, but I have another friend named Mary, and I want to speak of both of them, can I just write Mary with an S? Or should I change that Y maybe to IE? Or should I, as some people do, add an apostrophe? And you see I wrote here apostrophe. You'll often see people use apostrophes when they're writing plural nouns, but that really doesn't make any sense, because the apostrophe is a symbol that letters have been dropped. So for example, if I say is reading, I can abbreviate that by writing Mary's reading. Mary's reading. That apostrophe replaces that I that's been dropped. And Mary's is a contraction. Letters, one or more letters has been dropped, and the apostrophe is used to mark where letters have been removed. The reason why that's done is because Mary is reading can be reduced to Mary's reading, which is easier to say and simpler, which is another example of euphony. We also use the apostrophe for possession. I may say Mary's book, and I'm not going to explain where this comes from. We'll probably learn it in a future lesson, but the apostrophe S is used to signify possession, the book that belongs to Mary. And that's it for this lesson on plural forms. What I wanted to emphasize was that what I'd like you to pay most attention to in the lesson is not all of the rules and the exceptions and the details, which can be overwhelming. And the bottom line is you're never going to master the use of singular and plural nouns unless you make an effort over time to always get it right, or to use a dictionary and look it up if you're not sure, or pay attention as you're reading and make mental notes of what you see in your reading, so that when you write or when you speak, you can imitate the authors or speakers that you've read and heard before. That's a commitment you need to make in order to be intelligent and speak and write correctly. There's no other way to do it. No simple rules, as you'll see, and you shouldn't let these rules confuse you, as if there's mistakes when you see examples that don't follow the rules. That's not what these rules are. These rules are just generalizations of how it's often done. But you'll see by the exceptions, it's not always done like that, and that creates some confusion. But look through those rules, look through the exceptions, ask the question, why? Why do we do it this way? Why do we express the plural in this way? Why does this noun have no singular form? Why does this noun have no plural form? If you pay attention to the why and concentrate on the reasons, you'll start to understand, and you'll be in much better position in the future to be able to use singular and plural nouns correctly. So just to sum up real quick, in Lesson 4, we seek to understand how singular and plural nouns are expressed in English. We see that there are rules or generalizations for how this is normally done, but we also see that there are exceptions, which prove to us that these are not actual rules for how to make singular and plural forms. They're just observations about how people, especially people who are known to be great speakers and writers, how they do it, so that we can imitate the customs that they've established by their own practice. So we want to focus on not so much on these observations as if they're some kind of rule, but we simply want to see that this is how people normally do this in English, and we want to ask the question, why? And one of the main reasons why is because it simply sounds better and it's easier to pronounce. That's one of the reasons they do what they do. We want to see that there are some words that do not have plural forms. Some words do not have singular forms. Some words are referred to only in a plural sense, but they can sometimes be referred to in a singular sense or in a different plural sense. We saw that proper nouns lead us to some confusion as to how they should be made plural, because proper nouns by their nature are really not used in the plural. But there are some strange times where we do need to use a proper noun in the plural, and that throws us into a loop because we can't figure out how we should do that. So All of this is covered in your book. Study the book carefully. Prepare for your quiz, which will test every detail. Submit the written assessment to me if you're a subscribed student, where I'm going to get into some of these principles with you. Make sure you're thinking and understanding the principles, and I'll get back to you with review and feedback on those assignments. If you have any questions about this lesson, or even in your studies or in your writing day by day, if you find an example where you run into a word that you aren't sure how you should express in the plural, I'd like you to post that example on the forum so we can see a good example in real life of where these observations in this lesson can help us. So please do that. If you find examples, post them on the forums so we can look at them and talk about them and see how these rules or principles in our lesson apply. If there's anything in the lesson you're confused by or not certain about, please post a question on the forum or send me an email. Or if you're subscribed to premium enrollment, we can chat about that during your weekly tutorial hour. So I hope that's helpful for lesson 4, studying number in nouns. God bless your studies.